Jeffrey Dahmer. Even decades later, chills, right? Why are we so drawn to these figures? It's got to be more than just the gruesome stuff.
You hit it right on the head. It's the why, the psychology that keeps us coming back. And today, we've got some seriously unique material.
Oh, yeah.
Prison phone calls between Dahmer and his father, Lionel. A whole series on Fascination adds a whole new layer to what we think we know. Plus, we've got the Wikipedia, news articles, the whole 9 yards.
Those phone calls, I mean, that father-son dynamic, when you're dealing with something this horrific.
Disturbing, right?
Totally. So through all this, we're going to try to really understand Dahmer, his early life, how things escalated. You might think you know this case, but trust me, there's some things here that'll make you rethink everything.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. Dahmer's childhood. Anything that hinted at what was to come.
Well, he was born in Milwaukee, 1960. Normal enough, but his family moved around a lot, and his parents, their relationship was a mess. Ended in a bitter divorce when he was 18.
Wow.
That kind of instability can do a number on a kid.
Like a shaky foundation. Can't hold the weight of what's coming.
And there's this creepy thing I read. Dahmer's dad found a box of pornography at his grandmother's house.
Dahmer was living with his grandma, right?
Yep. Makes you wonder, did this early exposure have something to do with his later, obsessions?
Like some morbid foreshadowing.
And some sources even say he might have been molested by a neighbor at 8 years old. Later denied, but still another layer of potential trauma.
Man. And then just weeks after graduating high school, 18 years old, his first murder.
Yeah.
18. Hard to wrap my head around that.
Picked up a hitchhiker, Stephen Mark Hicks, lured him back to his parents' place with the promise of beer.
Wait, his parents' house? Was anyone home?
Father was on a business trip. Mother and brother were visiting relatives, so he was alone in the house with Hicks. Bludgeoned him with a dumbbell, strangled him, and then...
This is where it gets really disturbing.
Yeah, this is where that pattern starts.
He dismembered the body, scattered the remains in the woods behind the house.
Exactly. And for a while, it seemed like that might have been it. One horrifying act. He went to college, even enlisted in the army.
So he's trying to have a normal life.
Seems like it. But those inner demons, they were still there. Got discharged for drinking, ended up back in Wisconsin living with his grandmother again. And that's when the killing started up again. This time in Milwaukee.
And they got worse.
Way worse.
This is between 87 and 91, right?
Yep. More frequent, way more gruesome. We're talking necrophilia.
Having sex with them, with the bodies.
Yeah. And cannibalism.
Huh.
He even started keeping body parts in his apartment.
God, I remember that one detail from that Fascination show, that retired police lieutenant. He talked about this sweet chemical smell.
Ugh, just thinking about it.
Sends chills down my spine.
I mean, in forensics, we know certain stages of decomposition. They have unique odors. Imagine that apartment. The chemicals.
Right.
Just awful.
And Dahmer himself said he kept the remains because it was, quote, his way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty.
It's chilling. Shows how detached he was from the fact that these were people.
Like trophies.
Exactly.
And most of his victims were young men of color, often from marginalized communities. What do you think that says about Milwaukee at the time?
Milwaukee was dealing with a lot of racial tension. Dahmer was able to prey on these young men, knowing they were less likely to be reported missing, less likely to be taken seriously. It's a terrible example of how bias, can have real consequences, creates these blind spots that allow these predators to just operate.
But let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about Dahmer's psychology. The big question, the one that everyone was asking during his trial, was he insane?
He was diagnosed with, borderline personality disorder? Schizotypal personality disorder.
Right.
And a psychotic disorder. I mean,
It's a lot, and those are serious diagnoses. But the court found him legally sane.
Legally sane. But how? I mean, the things he did, how can someone do that and not be insane? That's the debate, right? And it went on throughout the trial, and it's still going on today, really. The prosecution, their argument was that, okay, he had these disorders, but they didn't stop him from knowing right from wrong. He was in control. And the way he planned his crimes so meticulously, that supports that argument.
So they're saying he knew it was wrong, but he did it anyway.
Exactly. But then the defense, they said, no, he was driven by these obsessions, these impulses he couldn't control. He was a slave to his illness, basically. And then, to make things even more complicated, he expressed remorse. He even, found religion in prison.
It's a complicated picture, that's for sure. I remember reading about that forensic psychiatrist, Park Dietz. He made this connection between Dahmer and Movie villains?
Oh yeah, Dietz. He said Dahmer was fascinated by like the villains in The Exorcist III, Return of the Jedi, that kind of thing. Really,
Yeah.
like he was drawn to the power those characters had, their control,
Yeah.
almost like he was trying to be like them.
That's a scary thought.
It is, and even other serial killers had opinions about Dahmer's mental state. Like John Wayne Gacy, he thought Dahmer was totally sane.
Wow.
It just shows you, even in that world, there are different interpretations. But in the end, the court found Dahmer sane, and that had a huge impact on his sentencing. 15 consecutive life sentences, over 900 years.
He ended up at Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. And that's where things get really strange. He found religion, even collected like $12,000 from pen pals.
Yeah, it's a strange mix, right? This man who did these unspeakable things, searching for redemption and then getting money from people who are fascinated by his crimes, it says something about our relationship as a society with figures like Dahmer.
It's like this morbid curiosity. We can't ignore it.
Exactly, and that curiosity is at the heart of what we're doing here today. Speaking of which, let's get back to those prison phone calls with his father, Lionel. I gotta say, listening to those was unsettling.
I can imagine. What must that have been like for Lionel? To love your child, but also know the horrific things they've done?
That's the question that hangs over every one of those conversations. You can hear Lionel struggling with it, the guilt, the confusion, the desperate need to understand. There are times where he seems to be in denial almost, downplaying what his son did, or even saying maybe Satan was involved.
Like he's searching for any explanation that could maybe absolve his son, hold on to some hope that there's good in him somewhere.
It's heartbreaking, really disturbing too. It makes you think about the limits of love, of forgiveness. Are there even limits in a situation like this?
That's a tough one. And it brings us back to those bigger themes, the failures of our systems, the mental health aspect. Here's a young man who was obviously troubled. Could things have been different if he had gotten help?
It's impossible to know for sure. But it does make you think, right? About early intervention, access to mental health resources. It's not just about Dahmer. How many people are out there suffering, not getting the help they need? We need to change that. Create a society that makes mental health a priority.
I agree. It's not just about treatment. It's about creating a culture where people can talk about it. And we also can't forget about the societal factors, the things that contributed to his crimes.
Right, the prejudice, the socioeconomic disparities. Dahmer targeted marginalized individuals. That's a pattern we see over and over. We have to address those inequalities.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the details of his crimes to the psychology to the societal forces at work. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but these conversations are important. Dahmer's story reminds us that darkness can exist anywhere, even in people who seem ordinary. And we need to understand that darkness if we want to prevent it from happening again.
It's easy to just call him a monster and move on, but I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just slapping a label on him, that doesn't really help us understand what happened. And it definitely doesn't help us prevent something like this from happening again.
We talked about his childhood, how his crimes escalated, the psychology, the societal context. But there's one more thing we need to talk about. Dahmer's death. Murdered in prison in 1994 by another inmate, Christopher Scarver.
Scarver.
Yeah.
Why he did it, that's still up for debate. Some people say it was revenge for Dahmer's victims. Others say it was about race.
Tragic ending to an already horrific story. But it doesn't really end there, does it?
No, not really. The impact of Dahmer's crimes, it's still being felt today.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the Synthesumphone family. Their son, Conorak, he was one of Dahmer's victims.
Right.
They sued the city of Milwaukee, the police department. Conorak actually escaped from Dahmer's apartment, but...
The police took him back.
Yeah, they encountered Dahmer, they encountered Conorak, and they took Conorak back to Dahmer's apartment.
It's awful.
There was a lot of criticism about how the police handled that situation, and it really highlights the systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to keep doing what he was doing.
How bias can have these horrible consequences.
Exactly. The Oxford apartments where Dahmer committed a lot of his crimes, they were demolished. There was even this controversy about trying to auction off his belongings. A lot of people thought it was disgusting, the idea of someone profiting off of that.
I can see why.
But then you have this other side of it. The public fascination with Dahmer, all the documentaries, the movies, the TV shows.
It's like, we can't look away, even though it's horrifying. Why do you think that is?
I think it's more than just morbid curiosity. I think Dahmer's story taps into something primal, something deep within us. It's like it forces us to confront this really disturbing idea that evil can exist anywhere. in anyone. It makes us question everything we think we know about human nature.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to turn it back to you, the listener. What's stuck with you? What new perspectives have you gained? It's heavy stuff, for sure, but I hope it's given you something to think about.
Dahmer's story, it's a reminder. We need to be vigilant, not just in protecting ourselves, but in creating a society that addresses the root causes of this kind of violence. Poverty, inequality, lack of access to mental health care. We need to talk about these things, even though they're uncomfortable.
Before we go, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked a lot about Dahmer's need for control, his need to possess his victims, to manipulate them. But what if that need for control was, in a way, a twisted expression of something else, a need for connection? What if his crimes were, I know this is a disturbing thought, but
Yeah.
what if they were his way of trying to fulfill a need for intimacy, a need that he didn't know how to meet in a healthy way?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But it makes you wonder, if Dahmer had found healthy ways to connect, to feel seen, to feel understood, could all of this have been prevented? We'll never know the answer to that question, but it does make you think about how important it is to build genuine connections, to reach out to those who are isolated, who are struggling. Dahmer's legacy is a dark one, no question about it, but it's also a call to action, to be more aware, more compassionate, more proactive in creating a world where tragedies like this are less likely to happen.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, understanding the darkness, it doesn't mean you condone it. It means you're ready to face it, to challenge it, and to work towards a world where it has less power,